The same planet that built the Roman Empire also became the Christian devil. For 2,000 years, Saturn ruled Rome as the god of golden ages and justice. Then medieval Christianity transformed him into cosmic evil, erasing one of history's most complex spiritual relationships. The god who gave Romans their calendar, their treasury, and their greatest festival didn't disappear when Christianity rose to power. He went underground, morphing through alchemy, astrology, and secret societies into something far stranger than either his Roman worshippers or Christian opponents ever imagined. So before we trace Saturn's transformation from harvest deity to cosmic adversary, hit that like button if you're ready to discover how one planet's mythology shaped 2,000 years of Western spirituality, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever wondered why Saturn has rings while other planets don't? And what ancient cultures thought those rings meant? Long before telescopes revealed Saturn's true nature, Roman priests watched him move across the heavens with the slow patience of time itself. The coin gleams in the torchlight, its silver surface worn smooth by countless Roman hands. Stamped into its face is the profile of a bearded god, his hair crowned with a wreath of grain, his eyes holding the weight of eternity. Above his head, Latin letters spell out his name. Below, the temple that housed Rome's greatest treasure, not gold or jewels, but something far more precious, the public treasury, the empire's beating heart. This is not the Saturn of medieval nightmares or modern conspiracy. This is the god who built Rome, who gave Romans their laws, their calendar, their very identity as civilized beings. The god who ruled the Golden Age, when men lived without war, without want, without the chains of slavery. But gods, like empires, carry the seeds of their own transformation. In the shadow of the Capitoline Hill, where the Temple of Saturn has stood for 1,000 years, the festival preparations begin. The year is 217 AD, and Emperor Caracalla has just been murdered on a dusty road in Syria. The empire trembles on the edge of chaos, but in Rome, the Saturnalia approaches with its ancient promise of renewal. For 7 days, the world will turn upside down. For 7 days, Saturn will rule again. The temple doors swing open with a sound like thunder. Inside, the god's statue stands wreathed in wool, bound, the priests say, to keep his power contained until the proper moment for its release. His feet rest in chains, ancient bronze links that symbolize both his imprisonment by Jupiter and his role as keeper of cosmic justice. In his right hand, he holds a scythe, not yet the death tool it will become, but the instrument of harvest, the blade that separates grain from chaff, abundance from waste. Before him, on marble tables inlaid with precious stones, lie the scrolls that record every debt owed to Rome, every tax collected from Britain to Babylon. The Temple of Saturn is not just a house of worship, it is the federal reserve of the ancient world, the place where imperial power translates into monetary reality. Gaius Macrobius Ambrosius Theodosius enters the temple like a man approaching a shrine to his own soul. The year is 400 AD, and he serves as Praetorian Prefect of Italy, one of the most powerful positions in what remains of the Western Empire. But tonight, he comes not as a politician, but as a devotee, a man who has spent years collecting the stories, rituals, and mysteries of Saturn worship. His masterwork, the Saturnalia, will preserve for posterity what the rising tide of Christianity threatens to wash away: the memory of Rome's most complex and contradictory god. Saturn, he writes by lamplight in his villa overlooking the Seven Hills, was the first to introduce agriculture to Italy and to break up the uncultivated land with the plowshare. From this, he received the name Saturn, derived from satus, meaning sown or planted. Under his rule, no one was a slave or held private property. All things were common to all men. But Macrobius knows, as every educated Roman knows, that Saturn's story contains darker threads. The same god who brought civilization to Earth devoured his own children, to prevent them from overthrowing his rule. The same deity who created the Golden Age ended it through his own paranoid violence. The god who gave Romans their greatest festival also taught them their most profound lesson. All Golden Ages end in blood. The Saturnalia begins at sunset, with the cry that has echoed through Roman streets for centuries. Io, Saturnalia! The shout rises from the Forum, spreads through the Subura, carries over the Palatine to the Emperor's palace. In taverns and temples, in mansions and tenements, Romans prepare for the festival that transforms their carefully ordered world into beautiful chaos. Slaves dine at their masters' tables while their owners serve them wine. Senators don the caps of freedmen and play dice in the streets. Children rule their parents' households, making mock laws and issuing absurd decrees. For 7 days, hierarchy collapses, authority inverts. The rigid structure that holds the empire together dissolves into laughter and liberation. This is Saturn's gift to Rome, the recognition that order itself requires periodic destruction, that civilization survives only by acknowledging its own artificial nature. The Saturnalia teaches Romans what they rarely admit, that their empire rests on conventions rather than natural law, that their power depends on consent rather than divine mandate. But the festival also teaches them something darker. When the 7 days end, when slaves return to slavery and senators to their togas, when children bow again to their fathers and wives to their husbands, then Romans understand what they have lost. The Golden Age exists only in memory and ritual. Paradise is not a place but a performance, enacted briefly and abandoned reluctantly. In the temple treasury, scribes work by torchlight to tally the wealth of nations. Gold pours in from Dacia, silver from Spain, spices from Arabia, silk from distant Serica, beyond the edge of the world. The tribute of empire flows like a river into Saturn's keeping, and he guards it all with the impartial justice of time itself. For Saturn is, above all else, the god of time. Not time as mortals experience it, moment following moment in linear progression, but time as divinity perceives it, cyclical and eternal. Under Saturn's rule, the seasons turn, crops grow and die, empires rise and fall, ages of gold give way to ages of iron, and then, in the fullness of cosmic revolution, return again to gold. This temporal power makes Saturn dangerous in ways that other gods are not. Mars may bring war, Venus may bring love, but Saturn brings something more fundamental and more threatening, the knowledge that all things pass away. Under his influence, emperors remember their mortality, empires contemplate their endings, the powerful confront the inevitability of their own destruction. In the countryside surrounding Rome, farmers make their offerings to Saturn with the reverence due to the deity who holds their survival in his hands. They bring the first fruits of their harvest, grain and grapes, olives and figs, the bounty that Saturn's blessing has made possible. But they also bring something else, small clay figurines, sigillaria, shaped like human forms. These offerings carry a darker meaning than the Christian chroniclers will admit. The figurines represent human sacrifice, the ultimate gift that Saturn once demanded and may demand again. In the legendary past, the god required the blood of children, the lives of the innocent offered to ensure the fertility of fields and the prosperity of cities. The clay substitutes acknowledge this debt while avoiding its payment, but they also preserve the memory of what Saturn's favor truly costs. The transformation begins subtly, like poison seeping through stone. In the Christian basilicas that rise throughout the 4th century, bishops preach against the diabolic deceptions of pagan festivals. Augustine of Hippo writes that Saturn worship represents humanity's enslavement to demonic forces, that the Saturnalia teaches Romans to love chaos over order, rebellion over obedience, temporary pleasure over eternal salvation. But Augustine understands something that his followers will forget. Saturn's power lies not in opposition to divine order, but in revealing its temporary nature. The God who brings golden ages also ends them, not from malice, but from cosmic necessity. He is not the enemy of justice, but its most perfect expression, the force that ensures all accounts will eventually be balanced, all debts paid, all tyrannies ended. This understanding makes Saturn perhaps the most feared deity in the Roman pantheon. Other gods can be appeased, bargained with, bribed into favor. Saturn cannot be bought because he already owns everything. He cannot be threatened because he holds time itself as his weapon. He cannot be ignored because his influence touches every human life from birth to death. In the temple depths, where only the highest initiates may enter, the true nature of Saturn worship reveals itself. Here stand the ancient symbols, the scythe that cuts the thread of life, the hourglass that measures the span of empires, the wheel that turns through endless cycles of creation and destruction. Here the priests perform rituals older than Rome itself, ceremonies that connect the city's destiny to cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. The initiates learn that Saturn represents not evil but necessity, not cruelty but justice, not chaos, but the order that emerges from the destruction of false orders. They discover that the God who devours his children does so not from hunger, but from love. The terrible love that prevents tyranny by ensuring that no reign lasts forever, that no power escapes the judgment of time. But this knowledge comes with a price. Those who truly understand Saturn can never again find comfort in temporary victories, material wealth, or political power. They have looked into the face of eternity and seen their own insignificance reflected there. They know that all human achievements are sandcastles built at the edge of an infinite ocean, beautiful in their moment but doomed to dissolution. The last Roman emperor to celebrate the Saturnalia with traditional pomp dies in 476 AD, and with him dies the empire that Saturn helped to build. But the god himself does not die. In the rubble of temples and the ashes of libraries, in the fragments of coin and stone, his image persists. Christian monks preserve his story while condemning his worship. Medieval scholars translate his mysteries while declaring them diabolic. Renaissance artists paint his portrait while calling him demonic. Saturn survives because he represents something human beings cannot abandon: the knowledge that all things end, that every golden age carries the seeds of its own destruction, that the price of civilization is the memory of what civilized life costs. In the Vatican Museum, where scholars catalogue the remnants of pagan Rome, the ancient coin gleams under fluorescent lights. Its silver surface, worn smooth by countless Roman hands, still bears the profile of the bearded god, his eyes holding the weight of eternity. The Latin letters above his head have lost none of their power to disturb and fascinate. Tourists pass by without recognition, but occasionally a visitor pauses, drawn by something in that weathered face that speaks to modern anxieties about time, change, and the fragility of all human achievements. They do not know they are looking at Rome's most honest god, the deity who alone among the immortals refused to lie about the nature of existence. They do not know they are staring into the face of their own inevitable future. The coin gleams in the artificial light, holding secrets that survived the fall of empires, the rise of new religions, the transformation of gods into demons. Saturn waits, patient as time itself, for the next golden age that will require his terrible gifts of wisdom, justice, and the courage to acknowledge that all earthly powers must pass away. He has waited 2,000 years already. He can wait as long as time itself endures. The astrolabe trembles in the astronomer's hands as he traces the celestial sphere, its bronze rings catching the lamplight in the Library of Alexandria. Claudius Ptolemy has spent 30 years mapping the heavens, charting the movements of wandering stars, codifying the mathematics of cosmic influence. But tonight, in the year 150 AD, his calculations reveal something that chills him to the bone. Saturn moves too slowly, too coldly, too far from the life-giving warmth of the sun. In his Tetrabiblos, the 4 books that will define astrological practice for 15 centuries, Ptolemy writes the words that transform Rome's harvest god into something altogether more sinister. Saturn is cold and dry, the greater Malefic, bringing hindrance and destruction. His quill scratches across papyrus like a blade cutting flesh, each word reshaping humanity's relationship with the outermost visible planet. The scholar does not know he is writing Saturn's death sentence. He believes he is simply recording observations, noting correspondences, mapping the influence of celestial bodies on terrestrial events. But his mathematics will outlive his empire, and his classifications will echo through millennia like curses spoken in the dark. In the cosmic hierarchy that governs ancient thought, position determines power, and Saturn dwells at the edge of everything. Beyond his sphere lies only the realm of fixed stars, cold, distant, eternal. He is the final boundary between the mortal world and the void, the last guardian standing between human consciousness and the infinite darkness that surrounds all created things. This spatial isolation breeds spiritual contamination. Where Jupiter radiates warmth and expansion, Saturn emanates coldness and contraction. Where Venus brings harmony and union, Saturn imposes separation and loss. Where Mercury quickens thought and communication, Saturn slows all processes, weighs all actions with the gravity of lead. The planet's 29-year orbit becomes a cosmic metronome marking the rhythm of human aging, each return bringing crisis, limitation, the confrontation with mortality that no amount of power or wisdom can avoid. Roman astrologers note that Saturn's influence grows stronger with distance from the sun, that his malefic nature reaches full potency during winter months when his cold dominion echoes the seasonal death of the natural world. Vettius Valens, writing in the 2nd century AD, catalogues Saturn's earthly manifestations with the precision of a physician documenting symptoms of disease. Saturn produces those who are petty, malignant, careworn, self-depreciating, solitary, tearful, ever toiling, those who are condemned to slavery or imprisonment. His anthology reads like a medical text for cosmic pathology, each chapter diagging the ways celestial mechanics translate into human suffering. But Valens understands what later astrologers will forget. Saturn's cruelty serves cosmic justice. The planet that brings limitation also brings wisdom. The force that destroys false prosperity also reveals genuine virtue. The influence that strips away illusions also grants the terrible gift of seeing reality without comforting deceptions. In the villa of Marcus Manilius, overlooking the Bay of Naples, the poet-astronomer composes verses that will preserve Saturn's astronomical nature in imperishable Latin. Saturnus gelida tardus nive, Saturn, slow with icy snow. His Astronomica weaves science into poetry, transforming mathematical observations into mythological vision. Manilius sees what telescopeless ancients can never directly observe: Saturn as a world of ice and darkness, a planetary morgue where the warmth of life can never reach. His imagination populates Saturn's surface with the spirits of the dead, the souls of those who lived too long, who accumulated too much karma to find rest in more temperate celestial spheres. The transformation accelerates as Roman power fragments and Christian influence spreads through the intellectual centers of the late empire. In Constantinople, the last Byzantine astrologers struggled to reconcile Ptolemaic science with Christian theology. Saturn's malefic nature fits too perfectly with Christianity's need for cosmic adversaries, forces that oppose divine love. that tempt souls toward despair and spiritual death. Firmicus Maternus, writing his Mathesis in the 4th century, stands at the crossroads between pagan learning and Christian orthodoxy. His astrological manual preserves classical Saturn lore while subtly redirecting it toward theological ends. Saturn becomes not just a malefic planet, but an agent of divine punishment, the cosmic force that executes God's judgment on the proud, the rebellious, the spiritually corrupted. Those born under Saturn's influence, Firmicus writes with the authority of both astronomer and convert, are destined for lives of hardship, for their souls carry the weight of cosmic justice. His words blur the line between astrological determinism and theological predestination, making Saturn's influence indistinguishable from divine retribution. The Islamic conquest of Alexandria in 641 AD brings new perspectives to Saturn's astrological identity. Arab scholars, inheriting Greek astronomical texts through Syriac translations, discover in Saturn a planetary archetype that resonates with their own theological concepts. Al-Kindi, the 9th century philosopher-astrologer, develops Saturn's role as cosmic judge, the celestial force that ensures all debts, material and spiritual, receive their proper payment. His student, Al-Bumassar, pushes Saturn's malefic reputation to unprecedented extremes. In his great introduction to astrology, Saturn becomes the planetary harbinger of civilizational collapse, the force that destroys empires when their accumulated corruption exceeds cosmic tolerance. His calculations suggest that Saturn's conjunctions with other planets trigger the rise and fall of religions, the destruction of cities, the transformation of entire cultures. Al-Bumassar's Saturn is no longer merely a personal malefic. He is the cosmic executioner of historical justice, the planetary force that ensures no earthly power escapes the judgment of time. In the monastery libraries of medieval Europe, where Christian monks preserve classical learning while condemning its spiritual content, Saturn's astrological nature undergoes further mutation. The planet that once represented Rome's temporal authority becomes a symbol of everything Christianity opposes: material attachment, spiritual pride, resistance to divine grace. The Picatrix, that strange grimoire compiled in 11th century Spain from Arabic, Greek, and Latin sources, presents Saturn as the patron of dark magicians, the planetary force that grants power over death, disease, and spiritual corruption. Its ritual instructions for invoking Saturn's influence read like recipes for damnation. Take the blood of a black cat, mix it with quicksilver under Saturn's rays, and bury the mixture at a crossroads during the dark of the moon. Such instructions transform Saturn from astrological influence into magical entity, a cosmic being that can be contacted, bargained with, bribed into granting power over others. The planet becomes a deity again, but a fallen deity, a god whose worship demands moral corruption from his devotees. Medieval artists, working under church patronage, but drawing from classical sources, create images that crystallize Saturn's transformation from agricultural god to cosmic demon. In illuminated manuscripts and cathedral sculptures, Saturn appears as a bearded figure with a scythe, no longer the harvest tool but the weapon of death. His planetary associations shift from grain and gold to lead and grave dirt, from abundance to scarcity, from creation to decay. The artistic evolution reveals the deeper psychological transformation taking place in European consciousness. Saturn represents not just planetary influence, but humanity's relationship with limitation itself. Where ancient Romans saw Saturn as necessary cosmic principle, the force that ended golden ages to prevent them from becoming tyrannical, medieval Christians see him as spiritual oppression, the weight that drags souls away from heavenly aspiration. In the court of Frederick II, that 13th century emperor, whom contemporaries called the wonder of the world, Arabic astronomical texts meet Christian theological speculation in ways that reshape both traditions. The imperial astrologers, trained in both Islamic mathematics and Christian philosophy, develop elaborate theories about Saturn's role in prophetic revelation and imperial destiny. Their calculations suggest that Saturn's position at Christ's birth determined Christianity's eventual triumph over paganism, while his future conjunctions will herald the coming of Antichrist and the end of earthly kingdoms. Saturn becomes the cosmic timekeeper of salvation history, the planetary force that measures the interval between creation and apocalypse. But the most revolutionary transformation occurs in Renaissance Italy, where a new generation of scholar-magicians rediscover Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos alongside Hermetic and Kabbalistic texts that present Saturn in more ambiguous terms. Marsilio Ficino, translating Platonic dialogues in the Medici library, encounters passages suggesting that Saturn's melancholic influence, properly understood and skillfully channeled, can produce philosophical genius and artistic inspiration. His 3 books on life present Saturn as a necessary evil, the planetary force that destroys comfortable illusions and forces souls toward higher truth. Ficino's Saturn melancholy becomes the price of intellectual achievement, the darkness that must be embraced by anyone seeking genuine wisdom rather than popular comfort. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola pushes this rehabilitation even further, arguing that Saturn's apparent malefic nature results from human misunderstanding rather than genuine evil. In his oration on the dignity of man, he suggests that Saturn's influence becomes benefice when properly integrated with other planetary forces, that his limitations serve to concentrate and purify rather than simply restrict and punish. The printing press, that revolutionary technology that transforms medieval manuscript culture into modern information society, spreads these competing interpretations of Saturn throughout educated Europe. Johannes Kepler, working in Prague with the astronomical observations of Tycho Brahe, makes discoveries that will revolutionize Saturn's cosmic significance. His calculations reveal that Saturn's orbit is not perfectly circular, but elliptical, that the planet's distance from the Sun varies according to mathematical laws that govern all planetary motion. More significantly, his improved telescope reveals that Saturn possesses appendages, strange projections that seem to change shape and position over time. Kepler's observations, published in 1610, describe Saturn as having handles or arms, structures that appear and disappear according to no pattern he can discern. He does not yet understand that he is seeing Saturn's rings edge on, that the planet's axial tilt creates the illusion of vanishing and reappearing extensions. But the mystery of Saturn's changing appearance feeds into occult speculation about the planet's supernatural nature. If Saturn can alter his visible form, then perhaps he possesses consciousness, will, the ability to respond to human magical invocation. The astronomical discovery that should have naturalized Saturn instead makes him seem more mysterious, more potentially supernatural. Christian Huygens finally resolves the mystery in 1659, when improved telescopic technology reveals Saturn's true nature, a planet surrounded by a thin, flat ring that becomes invisible when seen edge-on from Earth. His discovery should have eliminated Saturn's supernatural associations, reducing the planet to natural phenomena explicable through mathematical laws. Instead, the ring discovery amplifies Saturn's occult significance. European magicians interpret the ring as a cosmic prison, a boundary that separates Saturn from other planetary influences and concentrates his malefic power. The ring becomes a symbol of limitation itself, the cosmic constraint that prevents spiritual elevation, that traps souls in material existence, that separates humanity from divine reunion. In the lodges of Freemasonry and the circles of Rosicrucian adepts, Saturn's ring becomes the ultimate symbol of initiation, the boundary that must be crossed by anyone seeking genuine spiritual transformation. The planet that astronomical science reveals as natural phenomena becomes, in occult imagination, the cosmic gateway between ordinary consciousness and transcendent awareness. The astrolabe trembles in the astronomer's hands as he traces the celestial sphere, its bronze rings catching the lamplight in 1,000 libraries across 2 millennia. From Alexandria to Prague, from Baghdad to Florence, scholars have mapped Saturn's influence, measured his movements, catalogued his effects on human consciousness and historical development. But their science has become mythology, and their mathematics has become magic. The planet that Ptolemy classified as cold and dry has evolved into something far more complex and threatening, a cosmic force that embodies humanity's relationship with limitation, time, and the acknowledgement of mortality. Saturn waits at the edge of the visible universe, patient as mathematics, implacable as time itself. His rings catch starlight like a crown of ice, and his gravity pulls at human consciousness with the force of everything we fear about growing old, about facing limitation, about confronting the end of all our golden ages. The greater Malefic watches from his throne of frozen methane and diamond rain, and in his distant gaze lies the reflection of every human soul that has ever wondered if the universe itself might be a kind of prison, and if the key to escape might lie hidden in the mathematics of the spheres. The hammer strikes the chisel with the sound of empire cracking. In a workshop beneath the Pantheon, Christian sculptors work by torchlight to erase Saturn's face from the marble relief that has graced Hadrian's temple for 2 centuries. Each blow transforms divine features into diabolic ones. The benevolent wreath of grain becomes twisted horns. The wise eyes become hollow sockets. The hand that once offered abundance now grasps a chain of bondage. The year is 609 AD, and Pope Boniface IV has just consecrated the Pantheon as Santa Maria Rotonda. The ancient temple of all gods becomes a church dedicated to the Virgin Mother, but the transformation requires more than ritual blessing. Every trace of the old deities must be obliterated, defaced, rebranded as demonic to prevent their worship from resurging in Christian hearts. Saturn suffers the most violent metamorphosis because his worship poses the greatest theological threat. A god who devours his own children to prevent his overthrow sounds suspiciously like the Yahweh who demands the sacrifice of Isaac, who drowns the world in flood, who hardens Pharaoh's heart to demonstrate divine power. A deity who rules through cyclical destruction and renewal echoes too closely the Christ who dies and rises again, who promises to return in judgment at the end of time. Saturn must be demonized precisely because he resembles the Christian God too closely for theological comfort. Justin Martyr, writing his first apology in 150 AD, strikes the opening blow in what will become a centuries-long campaign of divine character assassination. The demons, he declares, have caused the worship of Saturn to be instituted, knowing that this god devours children, so that men might be led to imitate this horror and sacrifice their own offspring. Justin's argument reveals the strategy that will guide Christian polemics for the next millennium: transformation through inversion. Saturn's mythological child-eating becomes evidence of demonic deception rather than symbolic wisdom. The god's role as harvester of souls becomes the devil's collection of the damned. The divine scythe that separates grain from chaff becomes the demon's weapon for cutting down the righteous. In the North African city of Carthage, where Christian martyrs have recently died in Roman amphitheaters, Tertullian composes his Apologeticus with the fury of a prosecutor demanding justice. His Latin prose crackles with outrage as he catalogues the diabolic deceptions of pagan worship. What god is Saturn but the devil himself, who demands the blood of innocents and corrupts the souls of his worshippers through the license of his festivals? Tertullian understands that attacking Saturn means attacking the heart of Roman cultural identity. The Saturnalia is not merely a religious celebration, but a social institution, a safety valve that allows the empire's oppressive hierarchies to release pressure through temporary reversal. To demonize Saturn means to declare Roman civilization itself diabolic, a strategy that appeals to Christians who see their empire as Babylon the Great, destined for divine destruction. But the most systematic assault comes from Augustine of Hippo, whose City of God provides the theological framework that will govern Christian attitudes toward pagan deities for the next 1,000 years. Writing in the shadow of Alaric's sack of Rome, Augustine argues that pagan gods are not mere delusions, but actual demons, fallen angels who demand worship through deception and maintain power through spiritual corruption. Saturn, Augustine writes with the authority of a former pagan who has seen the light, represents the demon who rules over time and death, who traps souls in material existence and prevents their ascension to divine truth. His worship teaches men to love temporal things more than eternal ones, to seek pleasure in this world rather than salvation in the next. Augustine's theological innovation transforms Saturn from misguided worship into active spiritual warfare. The god is not simply false, but actively evil, not merely mistaken, but deliberately corrupting. Christians who participate in Saturnalia, even those who see it as harmless cultural tradition, open their souls to demonic influence and risk eternal damnation. The legal machinery follows theological logic with bureaucratic precision. The Council of Tours in 567 AD formally prohibits the celebration of Saturnalia, imposing excommunication on any Christian who participates in the diabolic festivals of the god of time. The Synod of Rome in 745 AD extends the ban to include private observance, making it heresy to exchange gifts on Saturn's feast day or to light candles in the honor of the winter solstice. Each legal decree drives Saturn's worship further underground, transforming public celebration into secret ritual, communal festival into clandestine gathering. But the suppression also preserves what it seeks to destroy. The banned celebration becomes more precious precisely because it is forbidden, more powerful because it is dangerous. In the monastery of Monte Cassino, where Benedict has established his rule for Christian living, scribes work by candlelight to copy the classical texts that preserve Saturn's mythology while condemning his worship. Their De Natura Deorum preserves Cicero's account of Saturn's civilizing influence, while marginal notes identify every positive reference as demonic deception. The monks understand that knowledge itself can be corrupted, that preserving pagan wisdom requires constant vigilance against its spiritual poison. They copy Ovid's Metamorphoses but illustrate Saturn's child-eating with images of hell's mouth devouring souls. They preserve Virgil's Aeneid but reinterpret the Golden Age prophecy as demonic temptation away from Christian hope for heavenly paradise. The illuminated manuscripts that emerge from medieval scriptoriums reveal the artistic dimension of Saturn's demonization. In the Liber Floridus of Lambert of Saint-Omer, Saturn appears as a monstrous figure, with the head of a wolf and the body of a man, devouring infant souls while demons dance around his throne. His scythe becomes a weapon of spiritual death, cutting down the righteous and herding the damned toward eternal punishment. The transformation occurs not just in high theology, but in popular culture, where Saturn's festivals survive through Christian camouflage that preserves form while inverting meaning. December 25th, the climax of the Saturnalia, becomes Christ's birth celebration. But the gift-giving, feasting, and temporary reversal of social hierarchy continue under Christian auspices. Pope Julius I, establishing Christmas as a fixed feast in 350 AD, explicitly acknowledges the strategic appropriation. We have placed the birth of our Lord on the day when pagans celebrate their god of time, so that the light of Christ might overcome the darkness of Saturn, and truth might triumph over deception. But the appropriation proves incomplete. Christmas gift-giving echoes Saturn's ancient largesse. Christmas feasting recalls the Saturnalia banquets. Christmas charity toward the poor mirrors Saturn's temporary elevation of slaves. The Christian celebration preserves the pagan structure while claiming to redeem its meaning. In the cathedral schools of medieval Europe, where theology develops into systematic science, Saturn's demonization receives scholarly refinement. Thomas Aquinas, synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, argues that Saturn represents the cosmic principle of limitation, not the divine limitation that defines creature from creator, but the diabolic limitation that separates soul from God. Saturn's influence, Aquinas writes in his Summa Theologia, inclines men toward melancholy, despair, and spiritual sloth, the sins that prevent souls from ascending to divine contemplation. Those born under his malefic rays require special grace to overcome their natural tendency toward damnation. Aquinas' analysis transforms astrological determinism into theological predestination. Saturn's children are not merely unlucky, but spiritually endangered, not simply unfortunate, but actively cursed. The planet's influence becomes a form of inherited sin that requires constant prayer, penance, and pastoral care to overcome. The artistic evolution continues through Gothic sculpture and manuscript illumination, where Saturn's iconography undergoes systematic inversion. His hourglass, once symbol of wise timekeeping, becomes the instrument that measures souls' remaining moments before judgment. His chains, once representing his willing submission to cosmic justice, become the bonds that drag sinners toward hell. His throne, once seat of Golden Age authority, becomes the judgment seat where the damned receive their eternal sentences. Dante Alighieri, composing his Divine Comedy in exile from Florence, creates the most influential synthesis of Saturn's astronomical and theological associations. His hell follows the seven-circle structure of classical cosmology, with Saturn's sphere providing the model for the frozen lake at Hell's bottom, where Satan himself dwells in eternal ice. Here, in the realm of Saturn's influence, Dante writes of the ninth circle: all motion ceases, all warmth dies, all hope freezes in the ultimate expression of divine justice. His Satan, three-faced, eternally chewing the arch-traitors of human history, embodies Saturn's child-devouring nature transformed into cosmic punishment for the ultimate sin of betraying divine love. But Dante's astronomical knowledge complicates his theological vision. In the Paradiso, Saturn's sphere becomes the heaven of contemplatives, where souls who achieved spiritual wisdom through melancholy and limitation shine like stars in crystalline silence. The same planetary influence that produces hell's frozen depths also generates Paradise's most profound spiritual insights. This paradox reveals the fundamental tension in Saturn's Christian transformation. The planet cannot be entirely demonized because his astrological influence too clearly produces genuine religious experience, the melancholy that drives souls toward God, the awareness of mortality that generates repentance, the confrontation with limitation that teaches humility before divine omnipotence. In the grimoires that circulate in manuscript among medieval magicians, Saturn undergoes yet another transformation, from god to demon to conjurable spirit who can be controlled through proper ritual technique. The Key of Solomon provides detailed instructions for invoking Saturn's influence. On Saturday, in the hour of Saturn, when the moon is waning, inscribe his seal upon a plate of lead and bury it at a crossroads with the blood of a black goat. These magical texts preserve Saturn's divine attributes while making them available to human manipulation. The god who once demanded worship now offers his power to anyone skilled enough to perform the correct ceremonies, speak the proper words, make the necessary sacrifices. Saturn becomes a cosmic mercenary, selling his services to practitioners who understand the price of temporal power. The Renaissance brings new sophistication to Saturn's demonization as humanist scholars rediscover classical sources while maintaining Christian orthodoxy. Marsilio Ficino, translating Plato's Dialogues, encounters passages suggesting that Saturn's melancholic influence produces philosophical genius, the divine madness that lifts souls above material existence toward contemplation of eternal truth. But Ficino carefully distinguishes between Saturn's natural astrological influence and the demonic deception that classical pagans mistook for divine worship. The planet's psychological effects can be beneficial when properly understood and integrated with Christian spiritual practice, but worshipping Saturn as a god remains diabolic error that leads to spiritual corruption and eternal damnation. The printing press, spreading both classical texts and Christian apologetics throughout literate Europe, amplifies every aspect of Saturn's theological transformation. Popular editions of Augustine's City of God reach readers who have never heard of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. Vernacular translations of Dante's Inferno create audiences more familiar with Saturn as hell's architect than as Rome's harvest god. The hammer strikes the chisel with the sound of empire cracking, but the empire that dies is not Rome. It is the empire of classical mythology, where gods could embody both creative and destructive principles, where divinity included darkness as well as light, where wisdom came through confronting rather than avoiding the terrible truths about existence. In its place rises a simpler cosmos where good opposes evil, where light battles darkness, where salvation requires rejecting rather than integrating the shadow aspects of human experience. Saturn becomes the scapegoat for everything this new spiritual order cannot acknowledge about itself. The violence it requires, the limitations it imposes, the way its own authority depends on the very temporal power it claims to transcend. The workshop falls silent as the sculptors complete their work. Saturn's face has vanished from the marble relief, replaced by images of demons dragging souls toward punishment. But the stone holds memory deeper than surface carving, and sometimes when torchlight flickers just so, observers catch glimpses of older features beneath the Christian overlay. The wise eyes, the grain wreath, the expression of cosmic sadness that comes from knowing too much about the price of justice. The god is gone, but his shadow remains, darker and more dangerous for being unacknowledged. Saturn has become what his worshippers always feared he might become. Not the teacher who tests through limitation, but the tyrant who rules through fear. Not the judge who balances cosmic scales, but the demon who tips them toward damnation. The transformation is complete, but completion is not resolution. In the hidden places of Christian Europe, Saturn waits for his next metamorphosis, his next opportunity to remind humanity that all golden ages end, that all empires fall, that all gods, even Christian ones, must face the judgment of time. The manuscript trembles in the scholar's hands as he traces the Latin letters that will reshape Western understanding of cosmic evil. Eliphas Levi sits in his Paris study in 1854, surrounded by grimoires, Kabbalistic texts, and Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionaries, convinced he has discovered the secret that centuries of theologians missed. His quill hovers over parchment as he prepares to write the words that will birth 1,000 conspiracy theories. Saturn, he inscribes with the confidence of revelation, is Satan spelled backwards in Latin. The planet of limitation becomes the angel of rebellion. The god of time transforms into the adversary of eternity. But Levi's linguistic alchemy creates connections where none existed before. His etymology is invention disguised as discovery. His philology is poetry masquerading as scholarship. The French occultist believes he has uncovered ancient truth, but he has actually manufactured modern mythology, a confusion so compelling that it will echo through centuries of esoteric speculation. The real linguistic history tells a different story, one written in clay tablets and temple inscriptions, in the careful etymology of actual scholars, rather than the inspired guesswork of romantic mystics. In the archives of the British Museum, where Assyriologists labor to decode cuneiform script, the true genealogy of Saturn's name emerges from fragments older than Biblical Hebrew. The planet appears in Mesopotamian astronomical texts as Kayamanu, the steady one, referring to its slow movement through the zodiac. The Babylonians call it Ninurta, after their god of war and agriculture, while the Chaldeans know it as Kronos, the Greek name that will survive in astronomical texts for millennia. The Latin Saturnus derives not from any Semitic root, but from the Etruscan satre, possibly connected to the verb satus, meaning sown or planted. Roman etymologists like Varro propose this agricultural connection, noting Saturn's role as god of sowing and harvest. The name carries no hint of adversarial meaning, no suggestion of cosmic rebellion or spiritual opposition. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in the temples of Jerusalem, Hebrew scribes developed their own vocabulary for cosmic conflict. The word shaitan appears in biblical texts not as a proper name, but as a common noun, meaning adversary or accuser. In the book of Job, Hashatan, the adversary, serves as divine prosecutor, testing human righteousness with God's explicit permission. In Chronicles, Satan incites David to conduct a census, acting as agent of divine judgment rather than cosmic rebel. The Hebrew root eshtn means to oppose or to obstruct, carrying legal connotations of court proceedings and forensic examination. The Satan of early Hebrew literature is not evil incarnate, but cosmic quality control, the force that tests the genuineness of faith, the authenticity of righteousness, the durability of spiritual commitment. These two linguistic traditions, Latin astronomical nomenclature and Hebrew theological vocabulary, develop in parallel for centuries without any awareness of supposed connection. Roman farmers invoke Saturn for successful harvests, while Jewish scribes debate Satan's role in divine justice, neither culture imagining that later, mystics will conflate their separate semantic territories. The confusion begins in the medieval translation workshops, where Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic texts collide in the hands of scholars who speak multiple languages imperfectly. In the monasteries of Toledo and Palermo, where Christian, Jewish, and Islamic learning meet, translators struggle to render Hebrew theological concepts into Latin theological vocabulary. The Vulgate Bible translates Hebrew shaitan as Latin Satanus, creating the proper name that will dominate Christian demonology. But medieval scribes working with astrological texts simultaneously encounter Saturn's Latin name in contexts that emphasize the planet's malefic influence, its association with limitation, death, and cosmic judgment. The linguistic collision occurs not through etymological connection, but through conceptual convergence. Both Saturn and Satan represent cosmic forces that oppose, limit, and test. Both embody the principle that spiritual development requires confronting rather than avoiding difficulty. Both serve as cosmic quality control in systems where easy success indicates spiritual worthlessness. Brother Albertus Magnus, writing his De Mineralibus in 13th century Paris, demonstrates how this conceptual overlap breeds linguistic confusion. Saturn, he notes, shares with Satan the function of cosmic opposition, both serving divine providence through apparent hostility to human comfort and spiritual complacency. But Albertus carefully distinguishes between functional similarity and etymological connection. Saturn remains a planetary influence, operating through natural causation, while Satan functions as supernatural adversary, acting through preternatural power. Their similar roles do not indicate shared essence or common origin. The Renaissance explosion of printing amplifies every form of linguistic confusion as texts circulate without the contextual knowledge that manuscript culture provided. Popular editions of astrological manuals reach readers unfamiliar with planetary tradition, while grimoires claiming ancient authority present fabricated etymologies as historical fact. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, composing his 3 books of occult philosophy, attempts to synthesize Platonic, Hermetic, and Kabbalistic traditions into coherent magical system. His Saturn chapter explores the planet's association with melancholy, limitation, and spiritual testing. But he avoids claiming direct connection between Saturn and Satan, recognizing that such identification would require evidence he cannot provide. Instead, Agrippa develops what scholars now call functional correspondence, the theory that celestial and spiritual forces can share attributes without sharing essence. Saturn's astrological influence on melancholy and limitation parallels Satan's theological role as spiritual opponent, but parallel function does not indicate identical nature. The Romantic movement of the 19th century, with its celebration of intuition over analysis, emotion over scholarship, creates ideal conditions for Eliphas Levi's linguistic alchemy to flourish. In an age that values poetic truth above historical accuracy, Levi's Saturn-Satan equation appeals to readers hungry for hidden connections, secret knowledge, mystical correspondences that reveal the universe as more unified and meaningful than empirical observation suggests. Lévy's Dogme et Rituel de la Haute Magie presents his Saturn-Satan theory with the authority of revealed wisdom. The ancients knew that Saturn and Satan represent the same cosmic principle, the necessary opposition that makes spiritual development possible. Only Christian ignorance separated what pagan wisdom understood as unified. But Lévy's ancient wisdom is entirely modern invention. No classical source connects Saturn and Satan etymologically. No medieval grimoire presents them as identical entities. No Renaissance occultist claims they share common linguistic origin. Lévy creates his correspondence through wishful philology, seeing patterns that exist in his imagination rather than historical evidence. The invention proves more powerful than the truth because it addresses genuine psychological needs. Saturn's astrological associations, melancholy, limitation, spiritual testing, do resonate with Satan's theological function as tempter and adversary. Both represent cosmic forces that challenge human comfort, that demand spiritual growth through difficulty, that serve higher purposes through apparent opposition. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, founding Theosophy in the 1870s, adopts and amplifies Lévy's linguistics while adding her own layers of invented etymology. In The Secret Doctrine, she claims that both Saturn and Satan derive from ancient Sanskrit roots meaning truth and being, etymologies that exist nowhere in actual Sanskrit scholarship, but appeal to Western audiences hungry for Eastern wisdom. Blavatsky's synthetic mythology presents Saturn-Satan as the planetary logos of Earth, the cosmic intelligence responsible for humanity's spiritual education through material limitation. Her theory combines genuine Eastern philosophy with fabricated Western etymology, creating modern mythology disguised as ancient wisdom. The 20th century brings new sophistication to linguistic analysis as comparative philology develops scientific methods for tracing word origins through historical evidence rather than imaginative speculation. Academic dictionaries document the actual etymology of both Saturn and Satan, showing their separate linguistic histories and independent semantic development. But academic accuracy cannot compete with occult imagination. The Saturn-Satan equation migrates from theosophical literature into popular culture, from mystical speculation into conspiracy theory, from historical claim into cultural assumption. By the 1960s, authors like David Icke present Saturn-Satan identity as established fact rather than modern invention. The internet age amplifies the confusion exponentially as websites, videos, and social media posts spread Lévy's linguistic alchemy without acknowledging its recent origin or questionable methodology. Saturn equals Satan becomes internet fact, supported by selective quotation, circular citation, and the assumption that repetition indicates reliability. Contemporary conspiracy theorists elaborate the basic Saturn-Satan equation into comprehensive mythologies involving ancient alien intervention, interdimensional manipulation, and global occult control systems. The black cube becomes Saturn's symbol, connecting Islamic Kaaba worship with Jewish tefillin practice, finding Saturnian influence in corporate logos, architectural designs, and popular entertainment. But these modern mythologies depend entirely on the linguistic foundation that Eliphas Levi laid in his 19th century Paris study, the false etymology that connects Saturn and Satan through wishful thinking rather than historical evidence. In the reading room of the British Library, where scholars trace the actual linguistic history of both terms, the documentary evidence tells a different story. Saturn's name develops through Indo-European agricultural vocabulary, from roots meaning to sow and to plant. Satan's name evolves through Semitic legal terminology, from roots meaning to oppose and to accuse. The two words share no common linguistic ancestor, no historical connection, no etymological relationship beyond the modern imagination that sees patterns where none exist. Their similar sounds result from coincidence rather than causation, from the finite number of phonemic combinations available to human language rather than secret knowledge preserved by ancient initiates. Yet the false connection persists because it serves psychological functions that historical accuracy cannot provide. In an age of scientific materialism and religious skepticism, the Saturn-Satan equation offers the comfort of hidden meaning, the excitement of secret knowledge, the satisfaction of seeing cosmic patterns that validate spiritual worldviews threatened by empirical investigation. The manuscript trembles in the scholar's hands, but not from age or fragility. It trembles from the weight of accumulated error, from the responsibility of correcting misunderstanding that has shaped decades of spiritual speculation. The French occultist who created the Saturn-Satan equation believed he was revealing ancient wisdom, but he was actually demonstrating modern humanity's hunger for meaning in a cosmos that appears increasingly meaningless. His linguistic alchemy transforms Saturn from Roman agricultural deity into cosmic adversary, from planetary influence into supernatural enemy, from mythological figure into literal threat. But the transformation reveals more about 19th century spiritual needs than about ancient religious truth. In the end, Saturn and Satan remain what they always were, separate symbols addressing different aspects of human experience, distinct responses to the universal need for cosmic meaning, independent answers to the question of why existence requires suffering, limitation, and spiritual growth through difficulty. The confusion between them illuminates not ancient conspiracy, but modern vulnerability, the human tendency to see connections where none exist, to find patterns that validate preconceptions, to choose comfortable mythology over uncomfortable truth. The Saturn-Satan equation succeeds not because it reveals hidden reality, but because it conceals obvious facts beneath layers of appealing fantasy. The manuscript settles in the scholar's steady hands. Its trembling ceased. The words remain on the page. Saturn and Satan, similar in sound but separate in meaning, related in function but distinct in origin, connected by human imagination but divided by historical reality. Truth, unlike mythology, requires no embellishment to prove its power. The alchemist's laboratory glows with the light of 7 planetary furnaces, each flame calibrated to the celestial influences that govern metallic transformation. In the darkest corner, where shadows gather like conspirators, stands the Saturn furnace, cold iron vessels surrounding a fire that burns with the blue-white intensity of stellar death. Master Johannes Mercator tends this furnace with the reverence of a priest maintaining sacred flame, for he knows that Saturn's fire transforms not just lead into gold, but consciousness itself into wisdom. The year is 1580, and in this Prague workshop, hidden beneath the court of Emperor Rudolf II, the ancient traditions survive through encrypted formulas, coded manuscripts, and rituals passed from master to apprentice like genetic memory. Saturn has become the patron saint of secret knowledge, the planetary force that teaches through concealment, that reveals truth through apparent deception. The transformation of Saturn from public god to esoteric symbol begins in the ashes of classical antiquity, where Christian persecution drives pagan wisdom underground. In the monasteries of Ireland, where Celtic monks preserve Latin manuscripts while practicing Druidic astronomy, Saturn's agricultural symbolism merges with older traditions of seasonal death and rebirth. The planet becomes associated not just with farming cycles, but with the spiritual harvesting of souls prepared for higher consciousness. Brother Dungal of Saint-Denis, writing his Astronomy in 811 AD, demonstrates how Christian scholarship preserves pagan knowledge while transforming its interpretation. Saturn, he notes in careful Latin script, governs the melancholic humour that, when properly balanced, produces not madness, but prophetic vision, not despair, but the divine discontent that drives souls toward God. His analysis preserves classical Saturn astrology within Christian theological framework, showing how apparent, malefic influence serves divine providence by creating the spiritual conditions necessary for mystical experience. Saturn becomes the planetary force that strips away illusions, that removes comfortable delusions, that forces souls to confront ultimate reality without the cushioning of temporal success. In the libraries of Cordoba and Baghdad, where Islamic scholars preserve Greek astronomical texts while developing their own astrological innovations, Saturn undergoes parallel transformation. Abu Mashar al-Balkhi, known to medieval Europe as Albumassar, develops elaborate theories about Saturn's role in the rise and fall of religions, the birth and death of prophetic cycles. His great introduction to astrology presents Saturn as the cosmic timekeeper of spiritual evolution, the planetary force that determines when humanity is ready for new revelations, when old religious forms must die to make space for emerging spiritual truths. Saturn's 29-year cycle becomes a measure of individual spiritual development, while his conjunction with other planets marks epochal changes in collective consciousness. But Albumassar's most dangerous insight concerns Saturn's relationship to prophetic revelation itself. He argues that major religious leaders, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, receive their divine commissions during specific Saturn transits that prepare their consciousness for contact with transcendent reality. Saturn becomes not the enemy of revelation, but its prerequisite, not the opponent of spirituality, but its stern teacher. The translation workshops of medieval Europe, where Arabic astronomical texts meet Christian theological speculation, create the intellectual conditions for Saturn's esoteric revival. Gerard of Cremona, translating Albumassar's works into Latin, encounters astrological theories that challenge conventional Christian demonization of planetary influences while offering sophisticated alternatives to crude materialism. His translations circulate through the cathedral schools and early universities, where scholars like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon attempt to reconcile Aristotelian natural philosophy with Christian theology through astrological mediation. Saturn becomes a test case for whether celestial influences can operate through natural causation rather than supernatural intervention, whether planets can affect human consciousness without compromising free will or divine sovereignty. Albertus Magnus, writing his De Mineralibus in Paris around 1250, develops what medieval scholars call Saturn doctrine, the theory that melancholic temperament, properly cultivated, produces intellectual genius and spiritual insight. His analysis draws on classical sources while adding Christian innovations. Saturn's cold, dry influence concentrates mental energy, eliminates distracting emotions, creates the psychological conditions necessary for contemplating eternal truths. Those born under Saturn's influence, Albertus writes with the authority of both philosopher and saint, face greater spiritual challenges but also possess greater potential for wisdom. Their natural melancholy becomes divine gift when directed toward heavenly rather than earthly concerns. The emergence of medieval magic represents Saturn's most dramatic underground transformation. The grimoires that circulate in manuscript among court magicians and learned clerics present Saturn as the planetary ruler of binding magic, spells that constrain, limit, and control through supernatural rather than natural means. The Key of Solomon, compiled from Greek, Arabic, and Latin sources, provides detailed instructions for invoking Saturn's influence during magical operations. The rituals require elaborate preparation. The magician must fast for 7 days, wear robes of black or dark brown, work only during Saturn's planetary hours, inscribe the appropriate seals upon lead tablets, blessed under Saturn's rays. But the grimoire presents Saturn magic as theological rather than purely practical. The planet's influence serves divine justice by constraining evil, by binding demons who exceed their proper authority, by limiting the power of earthly tyrants who oppress the innocent. Saturn becomes heaven's enforcer, the planetary police force that maintains cosmic order through controlled violence. The Picatrix, that encyclopedic grimoire compiled in 11th century Spain, takes Saturn magic in darker directions. Its Saturn chapters describe rituals for causing death, destroying enemies, inducing madness in adversaries. The planet's malefic nature becomes a weapon available to magicians skilled enough to channel destructive influence through proper ceremonial technique. Yet even the Picatrix maintains theological framework for Saturn magic. The planet serves cosmic justice by eliminating those whose continued existence threatens divine order. Saturn's destructive power operates not through arbitrary malice, but through inexorable moral law. Bad people attract Saturnian destruction, while righteous individuals remain protected by their virtue. The Renaissance brings new sophistication to Saturn's esoteric development as humanist scholars rediscover classical sources while maintaining Christian orthodoxy through increasingly complex theological arguments. Marsilio Ficino, translating Plato's complete works for the Medici court, encounters passages suggesting that melancholy, Saturn's signature psychological state, can produce philosophical genius when properly managed through diet, exercise, and spiritual practice. His 3 books on life presents the first systematic Christian defense of Saturn's benefic potential. Ficino argues that scholars, artists, and philosophers naturally attract Saturn's influence because their work requires the mental concentration that his cold, dry nature provides. But Saturn's gifts come with dangers. Unchecked melancholy produces despair, madness, spiritual corruption. The solution, Ficino proposes, lies in balancing Saturn's influence with opposing planetary forces, using Jupiter's warm, moist nature to counteract Saturn's cold dryness, invoking solar influence to provide the light that dispels melancholic darkness. Saturn becomes not evil but dangerous, a force that produces wisdom when properly integrated, but destruction when allowed to operate without constraint. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola pushes Ficino's rehabilitation even further, arguing in his oration on the dignity of man that Saturn's limitations serve human spiritual development by forcing consciousness to transcend material concerns. Saturn teaches us, Pico writes, that true freedom comes not from avoiding restriction, but from choosing our restrictions wisely. His Christian Kabbalah presents Saturn as the planetary expression of divine severity, the aspect of God that maintains cosmic justice through limitation, discipline, and the refusal to permit evil to flourish unchecked. Saturn becomes not God's enemy, but God's left hand, the divine attribute that says no to spiritual complacency and moral compromise. The secret societies that emerge from Renaissance humanist circles make Saturn their patron deity, the planetary force that governs initiation, testing, and the gradual revelation of hidden wisdom. The Rosicrucian manifestos, published anonymously in early 17th century Germany, present Saturn as the guardian of the threshold between ordinary consciousness and illuminated awareness. Their mythical founder, Christian Rosenkreuz, allegedly receives his esoteric education during a Saturn return, the astrological phenomenon that occurs every 29 years when the planet returns to its natal position. The Rosicrucians teach that spiritual initiation requires Saturn's testing influence, that genuine wisdom comes only to those who can endure his restrictions, without losing faith in ultimate divine beneficence. The Masonic lodges that spread across 18th century Europe adopt Saturnian symbolism while carefully avoiding explicit reference to planetary magic or astrological determinism. The Master's square and compass echo Saturn's geometric associations, while the 3 degrees of initiation correspond to Saturn's slow progression through the zodiac. The lodge becomes Saturn's temple, the place where spiritual aspirants learn to accept limitation as the path to genuine freedom. In the library of John Dee, Elizabeth I's court astronomer and England's most learned magician, Saturn occupies a place of honor among the planetary spirits that govern earthly and celestial affairs. Dee's conversations with angels, recorded in his True and Faithful Relation, reveal Saturn as one of the 7 governors of creation, the planetary intelligence responsible for maintaining temporal stability while preparing consciousness for eternal perspectives. But Dee's Saturn differs from medieval grimoire traditions by operating through divine grace rather than magical compulsion. The planet's influence can be invoked through prayer and contemplation, but it cannot be commanded through ritual technique alone. Saturn serves God's will rather than the magician's desires, offering his gifts only to those whose spiritual development qualifies them for higher responsibilities. The scientific revolution of the 17th century creates new challenges for Saturn's esoteric traditions, as mechanical philosophy reduces planets to physical bodies, operating according to mathematical laws rather than conscious intelligences responding to human invocation. But the esotericists adapt by developing what scholars call dual aspect theory, the argument that planets function simultaneously as material objects and spiritual symbols without contradiction. Newton himself, despite his mathematical genius, maintains active interest in alchemical traditions that present Saturn as both physical planet and spiritual archetype. His private notebooks, hidden from public view for centuries, reveal extensive studies of Saturn's role in metallic transformation, psychological development, and the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries creates ideal conditions for Saturn's esoteric revival, as poets and philosophers rebel against Enlightenment rationalism by celebrating mystery, intuition, and the spiritual dimensions of natural phenomena. William Blake's prophetic books present Saturn as Urizen, the cosmic lawgiver whose restrictive influence must be balanced by imagination and spiritual vision. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, studying German philosophy and medieval mysticism, develops theories about Saturn's role in creative inspiration that combine Platonic metaphysics with Romantic psychology. His willing suspension of disbelief becomes a form of Saturn magic, the conscious acceptance of limitation that makes imaginative transcendence possible. But the most systematic revival comes through the Theosophical movement, founded by Helena Blavatsky in the 1870s. Her secret doctrine presents Saturn as one of the 7 sacred planets that govern human spiritual evolution, drawing on Tibetan Buddhism, Hindu Vedanta, and Western esoteric traditions to create synthetic mythology that appeals to modern spiritual seekers alienated from conventional Christianity. Blavatsky's Saturn serves as Lord of Karma, the cosmic principle that ensures all actions receive appropriate consequences across multiple lifetimes. Her synthesis transforms medieval Saturn magic into Eastern philosophy, while preserving the essential insight that spiritual development requires confronting rather than avoiding difficulty. The Golden Dawn, that influential magical order founded in London in 1888, represents the culmination of Saturn's esoteric development as initiatory principle. Their elaborate ceremonial system presents Saturn as the planetary ruler of the final grade before achieving full adeptship, the stage where spiritual seekers must demonstrate their ability to work with restrictive forces rather than being overwhelmed by them. Aleister Crowley, emerging from Golden Dawn training to establish his own magical system, makes Saturn central to his philosophy of Thelema. His true will doctrine teaches that genuine freedom comes only through accepting the limitations that define authentic selfhood. A fundamentally Saturnian insight expressed through revolutionary rather than traditional spiritual language. The alchemist's laboratory falls silent as Master Mercator completes his great work, the lead successfully transformed into philosophical gold through Saturn's patient instruction. But the real transformation has occurred not in the metal, but in the man, the slow, difficult process of learning to accept limitation as spiritual discipline rather than cosmic punishment. In laboratories hidden beneath royal courts, in libraries concealed within monastery walls, in lodges disguised as social clubs, Saturn's ancient wisdom persists through the careful transmission of initiated knowledge. The god who once ruled Rome's golden age survives as the planetary teacher who shows modern seekers that genuine spiritual gold comes only through accepting the lead of present limitation with faith in ultimate transformation. The underground transmission continues, flowing like an hidden river beneath the surface of conventional religion and materialist philosophy, carrying Saturn's dark wisdom to those prepared to receive instruction from time's most demanding teacher. The patient lies on the analyst's couch, her 29th birthday approaching like a cosmic judgment day. For months, everything in her life has collapsed. Career, marriage, health, the comfortable illusions that made existence bearable. She speaks of dreams filled with clocks that run backward, of waking at 3 a.m. with the certainty that time itself has become her enemy. She does not know she is experiencing what astrologers call Saturn return, that ancient planetary rhythm that Sigmund Freud will later recognize as the architecture of psychological crisis. In his study overlooking the Berggas, where shadows gather like evidence of the unconscious mind, Carl Jung traces the same patterns that medieval astrologers mapped in their celestial charts. But Jung calls them complexes rather than planetary influences, archetypes rather than astrological correspondences. His patient's breakdown follows the precise timing that ancient stargazers predicted, the 29-year cycle when Saturn returns to its birth position, demanding psychological reckoning with the gap between authentic selfhood and social performance. Saturn, Jung writes in his private notebooks, never intended for publication, represents what I call the shadow of time, the psychological reality that all individuation requires confronting limitation, accepting mortality, integrating the aspects of personality that consciousness prefers to deny. Jung's depth psychology rediscovers Saturn's ancient wisdom through clinical observation rather than astrological theory. His patients consistently experience major psychological crises at ages 29 to 30, 58 to 59, and again at 87 to 88, precisely the intervals when Saturn completes its orbital cycles. But Jung interprets these patterns as evidence of psychological rather than astrological causation, seeing in Saturn's timing the natural rhythm of human development rather than planetary influence. His analysis of melancholia, that psychological state that medieval physicians attributed to Saturn's cold, dry influence, reveals the same paradoxical relationship between limitation and creativity that Renaissance scholars discovered in their Hermetic studies. The patients who suffer most intensely during Saturnian phases often emerge with enhanced creative abilities, deeper self-knowledge, and what Jung calls tragic wisdom. The recognition that authentic existence requires accepting rather than avoiding psychological difficulty. In the London office of Dr. John Bowlby, where attachment theory begins its revolution of childhood psychology, Saturn's ancient associations with limitation and separation find modern scientific expression. Bowlby's research reveals that children who experience early loss or abandonment develop what he calls insecure attachment, a psychological pattern characterized by the same themes that astrologers attribute to Saturn: fear of abandonment, difficulty trusting relationships, the tendency to expect limitation and disappointment. But Bowlby's clinical work also reveals Saturn's constructive potential. The children who successfully process early trauma often develop unusual resilience, emotional depth, and capacity for genuine intimacy. Their early confrontation with limitation teaches them to value authentic connection over superficial approval, to build relationships based on realistic rather than idealistic expectations. The pattern echoes through every form of modern psychological research. Seasonal affective disorder, that depression triggered by winter darkness, follows the same timing that ancient astrologers associated with Saturn's dominion over the coldest months of the year. Chronobiology reveals that human circadian rhythms respond to the same celestial mechanics that govern planetary motion, that our psychological states fluctuate according to cycles that medieval scholars mapped through astrological observation. Modern neuroscience discovers that the brain regions associated with time perception, limitation awareness, and mortality salience activate in patterns that correspond precisely to the psychological profiles that ancient astrologers attributed to Saturn's influence. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes feelings of restriction and constraint, shows increased activity in individuals born during periods when Saturn occupied prominent positions in the astrological chart. But the most profound, modern validation of Saturn's psychological reality comes through trauma research, where psychologists document the same transformative potential that esoteric traditions attributed to Saturn's initiatory influence. Post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where individuals develop enhanced psychological capacities after experiencing severe limitation or loss, follows patterns that medieval alchemists described in their Saturn operations. The trauma survivors who achieve genuine integration rather than mere recovery consistently report experiences that echo Saturn's ancient symbolism, the sense that their suffering served a larger purpose, that their limitations became sources of wisdom, that their confrontation with mortality generated deeper appreciation for authentic existence. In the art galleries of Vienna, where Gustav Klimt paints portraits that capture the psychological complexity of fin de siècle consciousness, Saturn's aesthetic emerges through images that combine beauty with decay, gold with darkness, erotic vitality with memento mori symbolism. His Death and Life presents the same paradox that Saturn represents: the recognition that authentic beauty requires acknowledging rather than denying the reality of limitation and loss. The expressionist movement that follows Klimt makes Saturn's psychological landscape its primary subject matter. Edvard Munch's The Scream captures the existential terror that accompanies Saturn return. The sudden awareness that comfortable illusions can no longer protect consciousness from ultimate reality. His series of death-themed paintings explores the same psychological territory that medieval melancholics navigated under Saturn's influence. In the concert halls of Europe, where Gustav Mahler conducts symphonies that seem to contain all of human experience compressed into musical architecture, Saturn's temporal nature finds perfect expression. Mahler's music unfolds with the same inevitable progression that governs planetary motion. Themes that develop slowly, reach crisis points, transform through apparent destruction, achieve resolution that acknowledges rather than denies the reality of ending. His Ninth Symphony, composed during his own Saturn return while facing diagnosis of fatal heart disease, becomes perhaps the most profound musical expression of Saturnian consciousness. The ability to find meaning in limitation, beauty in mortality, transcendence through rather than despite the reality of temporal existence. The horror cinema that emerges in the 20th century makes Saturn's psychological themes its primary obsession. The genre's foundational insight, that authentic terror comes not from external monsters, but from confronting the monster within, reflects the same wisdom that Saturn offers through astrological influence. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu present characters whose encounters with supernatural forces mirror the psychological crisis that individuals experience during major Saturn transits. Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey makes Saturn itself the destination of humanity's evolutionary journey, the planet where consciousness must confront its own limitations in order to achieve transformation. The film's mysterious monoliths operate according to the same principle that governs Saturn's astrological influence. They appear at precisely the moments when consciousness is ready for the next stage of development, offering advancement through apparent restriction. The science fiction literature that flourishes through the Cold War period consistently presents Saturn as the location where human consciousness must confront its deepest fears about limitation, mortality, and the possibility that the universe itself might be a kind of prison. Philip K. Dick's novels explore the paranoid psychology that Saturn generates, the sense that reality itself might be a deception, that time might be a trap, that consciousness might be manipulated by forces beyond human understanding. But Dick's fiction also reveals Saturn's liberating potential. His characters, who successfully navigate their paranoid episodes, often achieve enhanced perception, deeper empathy, and what Dick calls authentic existence. The ability to maintain genuine humanity despite awareness of cosmic indifference or active malevolence. In the recording studios where popular music begins its transformation from entertainment into spiritual exploration, Saturn's influence manifests through genres that make limitation itself their primary subject. The blues tradition that emerges from American slavery experience embodies Saturn's essential insight that authentic expression requires acknowledging rather than avoiding psychological and social restriction. Jazz musicians like John Coltrane develop improvisational techniques that mirror the psychological processes that Jung observes in his Saturnian patients. Coltrane's A Love Supreme presents the same spiritual journey that esoteric traditions attribute to Saturn's initiatory influence, the transformation of limitation into liberation through complete acceptance rather than rebellion. The heavy metal genre that explodes in the 1970s makes Saturn's dark symbolism its explicit aesthetic vocabulary. Black Sabbath names itself after Saturn's traditional day and creates musical architecture that captures the psychological weight, the sense of cosmic oppression, the confrontation with mortality that characterizes Saturnian consciousness. Their music becomes ritual expression of the same psychological territory that medieval melancholics explored under Saturn's influence. But heavy metal also reveals Saturn's empowering potential. The genre's emphasis on individual resistance against overwhelming force, on finding strength through acknowledging weakness, on achieving transcendence through embracing darkness, reflects the same alchemical wisdom that Renaissance magicians discovered in their Saturn operations. The conspiracy theory culture that emerges through internet communication makes Saturn the focus of elaborate mythologies that combine ancient symbolism with modern paranoia. David Icker's Saturn Moon Matrix theory presents the planet as a cosmic broadcasting station that manipulates human consciousness through electromagnetic influence, trapping souls in material existence through technological rather than natural means. These modern Saturn mythologies appeal to audiences experiencing the same psychological pressure that ancient astrologers attributed to the planet's influence. The sense that reality itself might be a restriction, that consciousness might be imprisoned, that authentic freedom might require breaking through cosmic limitation rather than simply accepting earthly constraint. But even the conspiracy theories preserve Saturn's essential psychological function. They provide frameworks for understanding why existence feels restrictive, why authentic satisfaction seems impossible, why consciousness feels trapped between desire and limitation. The theories transform Saturn from planetary influence into technological control system, but they preserve his ancient role as the force that must be understood and integrated rather than simply avoided or denied. In the therapy offices of the 21st century, where cognitive behavioral techniques merge with mindfulness practices drawn from Buddhist psychology, Saturn's wisdom finds expression through therapeutic approaches that emphasize acceptance rather than avoidance of psychological difficulty. Dialectical behavior. Therapy teaches clients the same lesson that Saturn offers, that emotional regulation requires accepting rather than fighting the reality of limitation, disappointment, and loss. The mindfulness meditation that becomes mainstream psychological treatment operates according to principles that medieval contemplatives discovered through what they called Saturn practices. The instruction to observe thoughts without judgment, to accept present experience without trying to change it, to find peace through embracing rather than transcending limitation, reflects the same spiritual technology that esoteric traditions attributed to Saturn's initiatory influence. Modern attachment research reveals that the individuals who achieve what psychologists call secure attachment consistently demonstrate psychological characteristics that ancient astrologers attributed to well-integrated Saturn influence. They can tolerate uncertainty without becoming anxious, maintain emotional stability during periods of restriction or loss, form intimate relationships that acknowledge rather than deny the reality of limitation and mortality. Their psychological resilience develops through the same process that alchemists described in their Saturn operations: the slow, patient integration of dark and light aspects of experience, the recognition that authentic strength comes through accepting rather than avoiding psychological difficulty, the understanding that genuine intimacy requires confronting rather than denying the reality of separation and death. The patient rises from the analyst's couch as her Saturn return reaches completion. The career that collapsed has been replaced by work that reflects authentic values rather than social expectations. The marriage that ended in divorce has taught her to distinguish between love and possession, between intimacy and fusion. The health crisis that terrified her has generated deeper appreciation for the body's wisdom, for the way that limitation can serve consciousness by demanding attention to present reality rather than future fantasy. She does not know that her psychological transformation follows patterns that astrologers have mapped for millennia, that her individual crisis reflects cosmic rhythms that operate through every human life according to mathematical precision. But she understands what Saturn teaches, that authentic existence requires accepting limitation as spiritual discipline rather than cosmic punishment, that genuine freedom comes through working with rather than against the reality of constraint. The modern world rediscovers Saturn's ancient wisdom through psychology rather than astrology, through science rather than magic, through individual therapy rather than collective ritual. But the wisdom remains unchanged. The recognition that consciousness develops through confronting rather than avoiding difficulty. That authentic power comes through accepting rather than denying limitation. That the path to genuine freedom runs through the valley of necessary restriction. Saturn waits in the depths of every psyche, patient as time itself, offering the same lessons that Roman farmers learned in their fields, that medieval monks discovered in their cells, that Renaissance magicians found in their laboratories. The planet's external influence may be questioned, but his psychological reality remains constant. The archetypal force that transforms lead into gold, limitation into liberation, psychological death into spiritual rebirth. The ancient God lives on in the modern mind, teaching the same hard lessons, offering the same difficult gifts, demanding the same price for genuine wisdom, the courage to face limitation without losing faith in transformation, the strength to accept mortality without surrendering hope for meaning, the wisdom to find freedom through rather than despite the reality of cosmic constraint. The old man sits in his garden as the sun sets behind the mountains, his hands trembling not from age, but from the weight of understanding finally achieved. At 91, approaching his third Saturn return, He has lived through the full cycle of the planet's teaching. Childhood's innocence shattered at 29, Middle Age's illusions dissolved at 58, and now the final lesson approaching, like a ship on the horizon of consciousness. He understands what took 9 decades to learn. Saturn was never the enemy. He was always the teacher who refused to lie. In the archaeological sites of Göbekli Tepe, where German excavators uncover humanity's oldest temple complex, the same truth emerges from stones carved 11,000 years before Christ's birth. The massive T-shaped pillars, arranged in circles that mirror celestial patterns, record humanity's earliest recognition that consciousness develops through confronting rather than avoiding limitation. The animal carvings, predators and prey locked in eternal dance, speak the same language that Saturn teaches. Authentic existence requires integrating darkness with light, death with life, ending with beginning. The hunter-gatherers who built this temple understood what modern civilization forgot, that the divine reveals itself not through escape from natural limitation, but through conscious participation in cosmic cycles of creation, preservation, and destruction. They carved vultures and serpents, scorpions and wild boars, the creatures that embody what psychologists now call shadow material, because they recognize that wholeness requires acknowledging rather than denying the aspects of existence that consciousness finds disturbing. Saturn represents the same principle encoded in stone by Paleolithic consciousness. The recognition that spiritual development happens through limitation rather than despite it, that authentic power emerges from accepting rather than transcending natural constraint. In the myth cycles that survive from every culture that achieved literacy, the same archetypal pattern repeats with mathematical precision. The Mesopotamian Gilgamesh confronts his mortality through the death of Enkidu, learning that immortality lies not in avoiding death, but in creating works that outlast individual existence. The Egyptian Osiris achieves resurrection not by preventing his murder, but by accepting dismemberment as necessary prelude to spiritual reconstruction. The Hindu Shiva dances destruction and creation as aspects of single cosmic process, his third eye burning away illusion to reveal reality that transcends both life and death. The Greek Dionysus dies and resurrects annually, teaching initiates that consciousness must undergo repeated dissolution to achieve authentic integration. All these mythological figures embody the same psychological truth that Saturn represents. Spiritual initiation requires what alchemists called mortificatio, the death of false identity that allows authentic selfhood to emerge. The God who appears to destroy actually preserves what is essential by eliminating what is artificial, temporary, ultimately false. The mystery schools of classical antiquity, Eleusinian, Orphic, Mithraic, designed their initiation ceremonies around the same principle that governs Saturn's astrological influence. The candidate undergoes ritual death, symbolic burial, descent into underworld consciousness, where ordinary identity dissolves. Only after experiencing complete ego death can the initiate be reborn into awareness that transcends personal limitation while acknowledging cosmic constraint. At Eleusis, where initiates experience the mysteries that Cicero claimed gave meaning to both life and death, the ritual architecture mirrors Saturn's psychological function. The candidate descends into underground chambers representing the realm of limitation, loss, mortality. In darkness and confusion, stripped of familiar identity markers, consciousness confronts its deepest fears about finitude and meaninglessness. But the ritual descent serves resurrection. In the deepest chamber, initiates encounter what the texts call awful and ineffable visions, direct experience of the reality that lies behind appearance, the consciousness that survives individual death because it never depended on individual existence. They return to ordinary awareness, transformed, carrying knowledge that makes them citizens of both temporal and eternal realms. The Christian monasticism that emerges from the Desert Fathers, preserves the same initiatory pattern while translating it into theological language that emphasizes divine rather than cosmic causation. In the monasteries of Egypt and Syria, where hermits spend decades in caves practicing what they call spiritual combat, Saturn's ancient wisdom finds expression through disciplinary practices designed to strip away everything that prevents direct encounter with divine reality. The monastic cell becomes Saturn's alchemical laboratory, the place where consciousness confronts limitation, boredom, despair, all the psychological states that ordinary life avoids through distraction, entertainment, compulsive activity. The monk learns that authentic prayer emerges not from religious enthusiasm, but from what John of the Cross calls dark night of the soul, the psychological condition that medieval astrologers attributed to Saturn's melancholic influence. Brother Thomas Merton, writing from his hermitage at Gethsemane Abbey, rediscovers Saturn's teaching through Christian contemplative practice. The way to contemplation is through the desert of the heart, where we must face everything in ourselves that we have spent our lives avoiding. This is not masochism but necessity. Consciousness can only know God by first knowing its own nothingness. His journals record experiences that mirror the psychological crises that modern individuals undergo during major Saturn transits. The collapse of spiritual consolation, the dark nights when prayer seems impossible, the periods when God appears absent and spiritual practice feels meaningless. But Merton learns what Saturn teaches, that these apparently negative states serve positive function by eliminating false spirituality, removing comfortable illusions, preparing consciousness for authentic rather than imaginary contact with ultimate reality. In the Zen temples of medieval Japan, where monks practice zazen in meditation halls designed to amplify rather than eliminate psychological difficulty, Saturn's wisdom finds perfect cultural expression. The zazen posture, sitting motionless for hours while consciousness confronts its own restlessness, creates the same psychological conditions that astrologers attribute to Saturn's influence: restriction, discomfort, the confrontation with limitation that ordinary consciousness spends enormous energy avoiding. But Zen practitioners discover what Saturn teaches, that freedom emerges through complete acceptance rather than rejection of limitation. The meditation that begins as torture gradually becomes liberation, not because external circumstances change, but because consciousness learns to find peace within rather than despite constraint. Master Dogen, establishing Soto Zen in 13th century Japan, articulates the same principle that governs Saturn's spiritual function. Shikantaza, just sitting, teaches that enlightenment is not something we achieve through transcending limitation, but something we realize by fully accepting the reality of present experience, including its restrictions, its discomfort, its apparent meaninglessness. The indigenous traditions of North America preserve Saturn's initiatory wisdom through vision quest ceremonies that deliberately invoke the psychological conditions associated with his astrological influence. The young person seeking spiritual guidance spends 4 days alone in wilderness, without food or shelter, confronting the fears, limitations, and mortality that civilized life allows them to avoid. But the vision quest serves transformation rather than torture. In the extremity of physical and psychological limitation, consciousness often achieves breakthrough awareness, direct experience of the spiritual dimensions that normal life obscures through constant activity and distraction. The candidate returns to community not as victim of suffering, but as adult, initiated into awareness that can navigate both limitation and transcendence with equal skill. The modern therapeutic communities that emerge around addiction recovery preserve the same initiatory structure while applying it to specific forms of psychological healing. The 12 steps of alcoholics, an anonymous mirror, the stages that alchemists described in their Saturn operations, acknowledging powerlessness, admission of limitation, seeking divine assistance, recognition that individual will alone cannot create transformation, making moral inventory, confronting shadow material, making amends, accepting responsibility for harm caused by unconscious action. The recovery process succeeds not by eliminating addiction, but by transforming the addict's relationship to limitation itself. Instead of using substances to avoid psychological difficulty, the recovering person learns to find meaning through accepting rather than escaping present reality. The addiction that appeared to offer transcendence actually provided avoidance, while genuine spirituality emerges through conscious participation in rather than unconscious flight from ordinary human constraint. In the hospice centers, where modern medicine confronts its ultimate limitation, the inability to prevent death, Saturn's teaching achieves perhaps its most profound contemporary expression. The caregivers who work successfully with dying patients consistently demonstrate psychological characteristics that ancient astrologers attributed to well-integrated Saturn influence. The ability to be present with suffering without trying to fix it, to acknowledge limitation without becoming despairing, to find meaning in endings rather than only in beginnings. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, pioneering modern approaches to death and dying, rediscovers Saturn's ancient wisdom through clinical observation. Death is not the opposite of life, but its completion. Those who learn to die well teach us how to live well, not by avoiding mortality, but by accepting it as the context that gives every moment its preciousness and meaning. Her 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, mirror the psychological process that individuals undergo during major Saturn transits. The same resistance, rage, attempts at negotiation, and final integration that characterize responses to loss also define consciousness's reaction to any limitation that cannot be avoided, controlled, or transcended through individual will. The climate crisis that confronts 21st century civilization creates conditions that mirror those previous generations experienced through war, plague, economic collapse. The historical moments when Saturn's teaching becomes unavoidable rather than optional. The recognition that industrial growth cannot continue indefinitely, that individual consumption must be limited for collective survival, that technological solutions alone cannot solve problems created by unconscious relationship to natural constraint. All these insights reflect Saturn's ancient wisdom about the necessity of accepting limitation as prerequisite for sustainable existence. The environmental movement that emerges from this crisis consistently emphasizes themes that ancient traditions attributed to Saturn's influence. The recognition that authentic abundance comes through voluntary limitation rather than unlimited expansion. That genuine security emerges from working with rather than against natural cycles. That wisdom lies in accepting human participation in rather than dominion over ecological systems. Greta Thunberg, speaking to world leaders about climate reality, embodies Saturn's archetypal function, the messenger who refuses to provide comfort through denial, who insists that authentic solutions require confronting rather than avoiding difficult truths. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with business as usual and some technical solutions? We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. Her Asperger's syndrome, a neurological condition that creates social limitation while often enhancing pattern recognition and resistance to social conformity, becomes symbolic of Saturn's spiritual function. The apparent disability serves higher purpose by providing immunity to comfortable illusions that prevent necessary action. The wisdom traditions that survive into the modern era consistently preserve Saturn's essential teaching while adapting it to contemporary psychological and cultural contexts. The Tibetan Buddhism that gains Western popularity emphasizes Bardo practice, the art of maintaining consciousness during transitions, whether daily sleep-dream cycles or the ultimate transition through death into whatever follows individual existence. The Bardo teachings present the same initiatory structure that mystery schools encoded in their ceremonial forms. Consciousness must learn to navigate states where ordinary identity becomes unavailable, where familiar landmarks disappear, where awareness confronts the reality that lies behind personal existence. These states appear terrifying to ego consciousness, but prove liberating to awareness that learns to identify with what persists through, rather than despite, individual limitation. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, teaching Western audiences about Tibetan approaches to mortality, articulates Saturn's wisdom in language that bridges ancient insight with contemporary understanding. Learning to die well means learning to live well. Both require the same spiritual skill, the ability to let go of what we cannot control while maintaining compassion and wisdom within whatever constraints we face. The old man rises from his garden chair as darkness completes its daily victory over light. At 91, he has learned what Saturn teaches through direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. That limitation is not punishment but curriculum. That restriction serves expansion by concentrating consciousness toward what truly matters. That the teacher who appears harshest often offers the most essential instruction. He remembers his first Saturn return at 29, when every comfortable assumption about life collapsed simultaneously. Career, relationship, health, the basic faith that effort produces predictable results. He recalls his rage at the unfairness, his attempts to bargain with cosmic forces, his depression when nothing he tried could restore the life that limitation had destroyed. But he also remembers the breakthrough that came only through complete surrender. The recognition that fighting limitation created more suffering than accepting it. That authentic strength emerged not from overcoming constraint, but from finding meaning within whatever boundaries could not be transcended. His second Saturn return at 58 taught different lessons. The recognition that individual achievement matters less than contribution to what outlasts personal existence. That genuine security comes not from accumulating possessions, but from developing inner resources that no external circumstance can destroy. Now, approaching his third and final Saturn return, he understands what takes most humans multiple lifetimes to learn. Saturn was never the problem. Saturn was always the solution, the cosmic force that prevents consciousness from remaining satisfied with partial development, that ensures spiritual growth continues through successive encounters with limitation that serve expansion, restriction that enables genuine freedom. The stars emerge in the darkening sky, their light traveling across cosmic distances that dwarf human imagination, yet somehow reaching individual consciousness with messages older than civilization. Saturn moves among them with the same patient progression that has characterized his influence for the 4 billion years since the solar system achieved its current configuration. He was ancient when the first humans looked up at night sky and wondered about their place in cosmic order. He was teaching limitation and acceptance when our species learned to use fire, develop language, create the first rituals that acknowledge death as completion rather than failure. He will continue his instruction long after our civilization joins the archaeological record, offering the same lessons to whatever consciousness emerges to contemplate the relationship between individual existence and cosmic process. Saturn waits at the edge of every human life like a patient teacher whose curriculum never changes, because the fundamental spiritual challenges facing consciousness remain constant across time and culture. He offers the same choice to every individual: resist limitation and suffer, or accept limitation and learn. The old man chooses learning. His third Saturn return approaches not as enemy, but as graduation ceremony, the final examination that will reveal how well he has integrated the lessons of 9 decades spent in Saturn's school. He is ready for whatever comes next, because Saturn has taught him the secret that ancient initiates discovered in mystery temples, that medieval mystics found in monastery cells, that modern individuals achieve through psychotherapy and spiritual practice. The recognition that consciousness is already free, has always been free, will always be free. Not from limitation, but within limitation. Not despite constraint, but through conscious participation in cosmic processes larger than individual will. The Gatekeeper stands at the threshold between one world and the next, his ancient eyes holding the wisdom of stars. His patient hands extended in blessing that looks like limitation, but reveals itself in the fullness of time as the deepest form of love. The old man walks toward the house, toward whatever years remain, carrying Saturn's gift, the knowledge that every ending is also beginning, that every limitation serves expansion, that every death makes space for whatever consciousness becomes when it learns to identify with what does not die. Saturn's work continues, patient as time itself, necessary as gravity, inevitable as the turning of the spheres.